I bid you welcome.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
How do you like that, eh?
Even a man who's pure at heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the moon is full and bright.
I love dead, hate living.
It's a perfect night for mystery and horror. The air itself is filled with monsters.
It's moving. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. Oh, in the name of God. Now I know what it feels like to be God.
An absolutely iconic line of dialogue uttered by Colin Clive as Henry Frankenstein in Universal's 1931 masterpiece, Frankenstein. Indeed, it is alive. Many consider that scene the most memorable in all of Universal Monsters lore. The monsters are alive and well, a century later, and one must ponder if any of the classic monsters we know and love would exist today without the mother of all horror stories, Frankenstein. I'm your host, Ian the Wolfman, and this is the Monster Archives. Surprisingly enough, the words, "It's alive," are never spoken within the pages of the classic novel. In fact, the 1931 film is a monstrously loose adaptation of the original tale. Frankenstein isn't named Henry, he's Victor, and Boris Karloff's portrayal of the monster, while the most recognizable and, arguably, famous, is a far cry from the description and characterization of the creature in the original story. While the overall cautionary tale theme is present in both, the novel is a much deeper and analytical story that delves into the psyche of an obsessed man and the consequences of his actions. It is a masterpiece of a story crafted by an infamous woman that nearly everyone recognizes by name, Mary Shelley. Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was published on January 1st, 1818. Shelley began writing the tale when she was just 18 years old, with the first edition being published anonymously when she was 20. The second edition featured her name when published in Paris in 1821. Shelley was born Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin on August 30th, 1797 in London, England. Her parents were philosopher and political writer William Godwin and feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, the famous author of The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Unfortunately, Shelley's mother passed away less than a month after giving birth to her. Shelley didn't have a formal education, but she made great use of her father's extensive library. She could often be found reading or daydreaming, taking up writing at a young age. Mary met and began a relationship with radical poet-philosopher Percy Bysshe Shelley in 1814. Shelley had received much of his radical views from William Godwin's, Mary's father, political justice. He was still married while estranged to his first wife when he, 21, and Mary, 16, left England. They were accompanied by Mary's half-sister Jane. The couple traveled through Europe for a time, facing the loss of their first child, a girl who only lived a few days. In the summer months of 1816, the Shelleys, while not legally wed, spent time in Geneva, Switzerland, with friends Lord Byron, Claire Clairmont, and John William Polidori. The group entertained themselves with a book of ghost stories one rainy day. Lord Byron presented the idea that they each write a ghost story of their own. Mary had a difficult time initially, yet, after an evening discussion of the principles of life, the seeds of Frankenstein entered her mind. Quote, "Perhaps a corpse would be reanimated," end quote, Mary noted. Quote, "Galvanism had given token to such things," end quote. After midnight, unable to sleep, she became possessed by her imagination as she beheld what she described as the grim terrors of her waking dream. The following quote is taken from Shelley's introduction to the 1831 edition of Frankenstein. "I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world." Originally conceived as a short story, with Percy Shelley's encouragement, Mary expanded the tale into a novel. She later described the summer in Geneva as the moment, quote, "when I first stepped out from childhood into life," end quote. Shelley wrote the first 4 chapters in the weeks after the suicide of her half-sister Fanny. The loss of Shelley's mother, while she was still an infant, as well as losing her first 2 children early, are believed to have inspired elements of the tale. The first edition of Frankenstein was published in 1818 by the small London publishing house Lackington, Hughes, Harding, Mavor, and Jones. It was released anonymously, with a preface written for Mary by Percy Shelley and with a dedication to her father. It was published in an edition of only 500 copies in a 3-volume format. Critical reception at the time was mixed. Some praised the horror tale as extraordinary and full of poetic imagination, while others regarded it as a tissue of horrible and disgusting absurdity. Today, the shadow the timeless story is cast cannot be understated. While most are introduced to Frankenstein through film, or recognize Karloff's portrayal of the monster over the description of the creature in the novel, without Shelley's tale laying the groundwork of horror and science fiction, the literary world would be a vastly different landscape. But Frankenstein is only one example of a Gothic novel featuring a horrific monster. Let's shift our focus to France and the tale of a misshapen bell ringer who inhabits one of the most legendary cathedrals of them all. The Hunchback of Notre Dame was published on March 16, 1831, in 3 volumes, written by French Romantic writer and politician Victor Hugo. Considered one of the greatest French writers of all time, Hugo's literary career spanned over 60 years. He wrote a variety of genres and forms, best remembered for his novels, the aforementioned Hunchback of Notre Dame, as well as Les Miserables and The Man Who Laughs. Hugo produced more than 4,000 drawings throughout his life, and many of his works inspired musicals, including the opera Rigoletto. Initially a committed royalist, Hugo's political views changed as he became older. He served in politics, as both deputy and as a senator. His literary and political work touched upon many of the social issues and artistic trends of the time. He opposed absolutism, and his literary stature established him as a national hero. Victor Marie Hugo was born in Besançon, France, on February 26, 1802, to mother Sophie Trebuchet and father Joseph Leopold Sigisbert Hugo. His father was a military officer who served as a general under Napoleon. Victor studied law between 1815 and 1818, yet never committed to legal practice. His mother encouraged him to embark upon a literary career. He founded the Conservatoire Littéraire, a journal to publish his own poetry as well as that of his friends. His first novel was published in 1823, followed by a number of plays. Hugo initially agreed with his original publisher, Gosselin, to write The Hunchback of Notre Dame, known as Notre Dame de Paris in native French, referring to the cathedral, in 1828. However, Hugo's other literary projects delayed his work on the novel. After a few years, his publisher demanded the book be completed by February 1831. Beginning in September 1830, Hugo worked non-stop to complete the project. A primary theme of the novel is the value of Gothic architecture, which was largely neglected and often destroyed to be replaced by new buildings. The original French title indicates the cathedral itself as the most significant aspect of the story. Frederick Schoberl's 1833 English translation was published as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, thus shifting focus from the cathedral to the bell ringer within, Quasimodo. The story is a vast epic set in Paris in 1482 during the reign of Louis XI. The novel was presented as a giant epic about the history of a whole people. In many ways, the cathedral is personified as a witness to the human characters. A raw and mature tale featuring deeply flawed characters, each with their own views and class. Quasimodo, Esmeralda, and Frollo are immortalized characters, each symbolic in their own tragic ways. The novel was an enormous success, spurring on the historical preservation movement in that country, and strongly encouraged Gothic revival architecture. Ultimately, it led to the major renovations of Notre Dame Cathedral in the 19th century. The novel has been adapted countless times as stage productions, films, and television programs. All have strayed somewhat from the original tragic plot, even giving the tale a happy ending, as seen in the classic 1939 film starring Charles Laughton, as well as Disney's 1996 animated feature. The Disney version has an ending inspired by an opera created by Hugo himself, La Esmeralda. While Quasimodo isn't the novel's primary protagonist, the character has become beloved and celebrated due to his monstrous appearance, yet kind heart. Lon Chaney would bring the character to life on the big screen in Universal's 1923 silent epic that would launch the Universal Monsters legacy. A century later, audiences still adore the super jewel as it was described at the time. Monsters with heart are adored. But let's leave the sanctuary of Notre Dame behind and travel to the Carpathian Mountains of Transylvania, to a cold castle of the most famous vampire of them all, Count Dracula. Contrary to popular belief, Count Dracula was not the first vampire, nor is there definitive proof that the character was based upon Vlad the Impaler, at least not deliberately. Dracula was published on May 26, 1897 by Archibald Constable and Company. Written by Bram Stoker, it is the definitive vampire novel. Much like Frankenstein, it is an epistolary novel narrated through a series of letters, diary entries, and newspaper articles. Stoker was born on November 8, 1847, at 15 Merino Crescent, Clontarf, on the north side of Dublin, Ireland. His parents were Abraham Stoker and Charlotte Matilda Blake Thornley. In his younger years, Stoker worked as a theater critic for an Irish newspaper. During his lifetime, he was better known as the personal assistant of actor Sir Henry Irving and the business manager of the West End's Lyceum Theatre, which Irving owned. Stoker penned 12 novels and 3 collections of short stories. Dracula was the 7th novel, primarily inspired by a visit to the English coastal town of Whitby in 1890. Whitby serves as one of the locations featured in the story. The true inspiration for the character of Count Dracula has been argued in the time since it was published. Stoker met Armin Vambery, a Hungarian Jewish writer and traveler, before writing Dracula. Many believe Dracula emerged from stories told to Stoker by Vambery about the Carpathian Mountains and the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler, also known as Vlad Dracula of Wallachia. However, this claim has been challenged by many scholars and historians. It is believed Stoker discovered the name Dracula in Whitby's public library while holidaying there. On the name, Stoker wrote, "Dracula means devil. Wallachians were accustomed to give it as a surname to any person who rendered himself conspicuous by courage, cruel actions, or cunning." This explanation leads some to believe Stoker had, at least, some recognition of Vlad the Impaler. However, at the end of the day, Stoker made extensive notes while preparing and writing the novel, and Vlad Dracula is never mentioned once in those notes. Stoker spent several years researching Central and Eastern European folklore on vampires. Regardless, Stoker was influenced by the history and culture of the region. When published, Dracula was considered a straightforward horror novel. Also considered a gothic novel, it received favorable comparisons to other novelists, including Mary Shelley. Despite the positive reception of Stoker's work, he was not overly wealthy. While the novel was a success, the tale became timeless after theater adaptations and the films Nosferatu and Universal's Dracula were released. Stoker passed away on April 20th, 1912, at the age of 64. Some biographers attribute the cause of death to overwork, while others cite tertiary syphilis. Stoker's classic tale has impacted the world of pop culture, perhaps more widely than even Frankenstein. And while it was released upon the world in 1897, it wasn't the only novel that featured what would become a universal monster to be published that year. H.G. Wells, the father of science fiction, would present one of the most devious madmen in literary history, Griffin, better known as the Invisible Man. Claude Rains would bring the maniacal Jack Griffin to life on the silver screen in Universal's 1933 classic, directed by James Whale. Jack Griffin boasts the most kills of any Universal monster, a true murderous psychopath. One of the large differences in the film and novel is Griffin's homicidal tendencies. The drug monocaine, the key element of the invisibility concoction in the film, also has the side effect of slowly driving the user mad. While Griffin does murder in the novel, he was a violent and angry man before becoming invisible. This was a notable change in the film, a change that author H.G. Wells approved, but we'll dive deeper into that in a future episode. H.G. Wells remains one of the most prolific authors of all time. He is still regarded by many as the father of science fiction. His works span many genres. He wrote over 50 novels and dozens of short stories. In addition to his writing fame, he was prominent as a forward-looking, even considered prophetic, social critic. He was known as a progressive futurist whose works foresaw the advent of aircraft, tanks, space travel, nuclear weapons, satellite TV, and even something resembling the World Wide Web. Wells imbued a convincing realness in his extraordinary tales by instilling commonplace detail alongside a single fantastic assumption per work. This has since been dubbed Wells' Law. His most famous science fiction works include The Time Machine in 1895, which was his first novel, The Island of Dr. Moreau in 1896, which would be adapted to film in 1932 as the classic Island of Lost Souls, starring Charles Laughton and Bela Lugosi. The Invisible Man in 1897, The War of the Worlds in 1898, The War in the Air in 1907, and When the Sleeper Wakes in 1910. Born Herbert George Wells in Bromley, Kent, on September 21, 1866, to parents Joseph Wells and Sarah Neal, he was called Bertie by his family. As a boy, Wells had an accident that left him bedridden with a broken leg. He passed the time by reading books from the local library, brought to him by his father. He soon became obsessed with the worlds he discovered in those books, inspiring his desire to write. Wells cited The Perils of Invisibility, one of the Babs Ballads, a collection of light verse illustrated with comic drawings by W.S. Gilbert as inspiration for The Invisible Man. Another influence was Plato's Republic, a book which had a significant effect upon Wells as a child. Wells wrote the original version of the tale between March and June of 1896. This version was a 25,000-word short story entitled The Man at the Coach and Horses. Wells was ultimately dissatisfied with this version, so he extended and renamed it. Originally serialized in a British weekly periodical called Pearson's Weekly, The Invisible Man was published as a novel later the same year, 1897. While Griffin remains one of the most recognized phantoms in pop culture, we have one final literary monster to showcase: Gaston Leroux's hideous Eric, better known as the Phantom of the Opera. I'll admit, I was a bit surprised to discover The Phantom of the Opera as the most recent of the classic novels that would go on to inspire the Universal Monsters films. While The Invisible Man seems the most modern of the group, it predates the publishing of The Phantom of the Opera by roughly 12 years. Gaston Leroux's timeless gothic horror tale was first published as a serial in Le Gaulois, a French daily newspaper, from September 23, 1909 to January 8, 1910, releasing in novel form in March 1910. The tale was partly inspired by historical events taking place at the Paris Opera in the 19th century, as well as an apocryphal tale concerning the use of a former ballet pupil's skeleton in German composer Karl Maria von Weber's 1841 production of Der Freischütz, the first German romantic opera. Recognized throughout the world due to the many adaptations of the tale, such as Universal's two classic films, the silent 1925 thriller starring Lon Chaney, and the 1943 Technicolor musical, as well as Andrew Lloyd Webber's 1986 musical, The Phantom of the Opera is one of the most famous stories of all time. Gaston Louis Alfred Leroux was born in Paris on May 6, 1868, the illegitimate child of Marie Bedoire and Dominique Leroux, who married a month after his birth. Leroux schooled in Normandy and studied as a lawyer in Caen. He inherited millions of francs and lived wildly until he was nearly bankrupt. In 1890, he began working as a court reporter and theater critic for L'Écho de Paris. Leroux covered important international news as a correspondent, present at events such as the 1905 Russian Revolution. He left journalism in 1907 and began writing fiction. His first mystery novel was The Mystery of the Yellow Room, an astounding success. Leroux's contribution to French detective fiction is considered a parallel to those of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories in Britain and Edgar Allan Poe in the United States, both of whom he was fascinated by. Leroux was chiefly inspired by rumors involving the actual Paris Opera House, the Palais Garnier. One rumor involved a fire in the roof of the opera house melting through a wire holding a counterweight for the chandelier, causing it to crash down upon the audience, injuring several and killing one. Another rumor involved a ghost of some sort. The underground lake and caverns are, in reality, an enormous cistern, which does exist beneath the opera house and has been utilized for training firefighters in the dark. While popular upon release, the story gained much of its notability through its publication in newspapers. Leroux lived to see the 1925 Universal film after meeting with Carl Laemmle when the president of Universal Pictures was vacationing in Paris in 1922. Laemmle mentioned to Leroux that he admired the Paris Opera House. The author gave Laemmle a copy of the novel, which he read in one night. Laemmle bought the film rights, and the rest, as they say, is history. To date, Lon Chaney's infamous makeup as the Phantom remains the most faithful to Leroux's description of Eric in the novel. Leroux was made a Knight of the National Order of the Legion of Honor in 1909. He died at the age of 58 in Nice, France, in 1927, before he could witness the legendary success of his novel in full. The monsters are alive and well. From the pages of timeless novels to the early days of American cinema, the adoration and popularity of these characters, films, and novels has only grown more immense. We've taken a brief glimpse into the foundation of 5 of the monsters. I certainly hoped you learned something new. I absolutely did while researching and preparing this episode. But this is simply the beginning. We have many decades to cover and a plethora of films and filmmakers to spotlight. I hope you join us next episode as we shift our focus to the early days of cinema and horror, decades before the monsters we know and love graced the silver screen. The roots of the horror film are a diverse and exciting topic, and I cannot wait to uncover their secrets. This episode of the Monster Archives was written and produced by me, Ian Bates. For more on the Monster Archives, including scheduling updates and news, be sure to follow @Universal Studios Monsters on Instagram. And thank you for listening.